Thanks. Good. Well, good morning, everyone. Is everybody okay? Yes? Good. So I'm Nik Nanos. Big surprise, I'm showing up with some numbers and polling data for you. But I'd like to say from the get-go that what I am more interested in are the questions that you may have. You know, as a researcher, I know my numbers, I've dug into them, I understand the trends, but I'm always interested in other people's views on what those numbers might mean and what a potential path forward might be. So today we're going to cover off a number of things. We're going to talk about the landscape of populism and voter rage. And I know you see a lot of things in the news related to elections in Canada, elections in the United States, the United Kingdom, and France. But what I want to do, and I guess for some of you who, I think some of you are into politics, right? This will be the juicy bit, because I think these things are directly applicable to democracy, citizenship engagement, and elections and politics at every single level of government. Then what we're going to do is we're going to transition to the polling that we've done for the AMO. We're going to talk about government challenges in terms of the province of Ontario and priorities, people's perceptions of municipalities, and then we're going to talk about that three-letter T word, tax. How can Ontarians get the things they want? And what is potentially on the political menu as options to help them realize and get the services and programs that they definitely want and see as priorities, services and programs that they connect directly to municipalities. So first, let's talk about what I'm calling at least the age of voter rage. And why I'm calling it an age of voter rage is because, you know, this isn't just an evolution, right? Where, you know, we've seen in the past, and we know this in previous elections, that periodically voters get a little grumpy and they vote out governments. I see that as actually part of the natural cycle of things, right? That people want change. Someone might have been in power for too long, they might have done a great job, but they want something a little different. I don't see that as an age. I see that as part of kind of the natural part of democracy. But what is happening now is actually fundamentally different, because the structure of how citizens are making voting decisions is changing. The information that they're getting, or misinformation, that they're getting to make decisions is fundamentally changing. And the influence of very small swings in voter views on democratic outcomes is actually quite significant. So I'm going to put some ideas on the table, or observations on the table, and the very first has to do with this whole anti-establishment thing. And I would say that this is not a fad, that this is politicians that are framing themselves as anti-establishment are catching the attention of certain parts of the electorate. You know, Trump probably being the biggest and most sensational example of this. Trump was not only against Washington, you know, he talked about draining the swamp, and if anyone's a history buff, you should Google images of Washington in 1901 in front of the Lincoln Memorial, and you'll see that there actually was a swamp in front of the Lincoln Memorial. This is not, draining the swamp is not a euphemism. A swamp actually existed in Washington on the Mall up until after the First World War. But, you know, he talked about draining the swamp of lobbyists and career politicians and so forth. And, you know, he ran against Wall Street. You know, he even ran against his own party, against the Washington establishment. I guess the one thing that you can know about Donald Trump, at least, is that he is always against something. There is an enemy, whoever it is, and they are identified, and he is always fighting against the establishment. You know, we also saw this with Nigel Farage in the Brexit vote. He was the leader, the one-time leader of the UK Independence Party. And for any of you that follow UK elections, if you ever saw a picture of Nigel Farage, Does anyone know what a picture of Nigel Farage would include as props? Any guesses? A cigarette and a beer. He would actually stop reporters when they get pictures. Oh, 1 second, sorry. You want to take a picture of me? Let's go to the pub, and I'd like you to take a picture of me smoking, which I would say is anti-establishment, at least in terms of political correctness, and also drinking a beer, right? And here's was a man who did not go to university, who prided himself on being anti-establishment, did not go to any of the public schools, and he ran as an outsider. And that appealed to a certain proportion of people. And it's interesting, I put Macron on this list, and he's the new president of France, and people usually scratch their head. Why is Emmanuel Macron on this list? Well, why don't I just use kind of a little comparison? If I told you that Donald Trump wanted to be president, and he started off as a Republican, and then decided, you know what, this Republican Party thing isn't working for me, I'm going to create my own party 6 months ahead of the presidential election. And Donald Trump started his own party, then won the presidential election, and then won the most seats in Congress. What would you say? You would say that he would have rocked the political establishment. Well, that is exactly what Emmanuel Macron did. 6 months before, he went from being a socialist cabinet minister to forming his own party, En Marche, exclamation mark, note that, I guess that's kind of his branding, right? Created his own party, won the presidency. And the interesting thing about him is that he wasn't necessarily just anti-establishment, because he basically broke the establishment party system in France and reshaped it. He also styled himself as a maverick. Yes, I'm a Rothschild banker and a socialist cabinet minister. How do you like me so far? Right? I like to kickbox, would say Emmanuel Macron. And I'd like you to meet my wife. I met her when I was 17 years old. She is my life partner and political partner, and maybe you feel a little uncomfortable about that, but I'm in love and I'm very happy. So him framing himself as a maverick and breaking what I'll say the French political establishment. And I would go as far to say that Justin Trudeau was anti-establishment, or tried to. Why? Because when the Conservatives first started to define Justin Trudeau, they defined him as someone of the entitled group. His father was the prime minister, right? Part of kind of a leading political figure. Justin Trudeau had kind of a charmed life. He'd been a celebrity, and the Conservatives had their famous attack ads where they said he wasn't just ready, and tried to kind of frame him in that particular way. So, what does Justin Trudeau do? He builds a platform that talks about taxing the 1%, the most rich Canadians, right? What he's actually saying is that the 99% of us is who he represents, not the elite. And what else does he do? He decides to go into a boxing match. Who would ever thought that a Canadian political leader would step into a boxing ring with anyone, even on a friendly kind of platform, and put himself at risk, right? Not just physical risk, but political risk. And I say that was kind of the edge that he was trying to kind of cut. But what's more important, and this is the one thing that I want you to remember about the angry tale, right? And this has to do with the tyranny of small numbers. And this has direct application to every single election, municipal, federal, provincial. So think of it this way. Let's unpack some of the most recent elections. In the United States, Donald Trump is the president of the United States. I don't know if you got that. I couldn't have missed it on Twitter. But Donald Trump is president. He lost the popular vote by 2 to 3 million votes, right? So technically, if it was just straight numbers, Hillary Clinton would be president. But he won the Electoral College. Actually, more specifically, he won the Electoral College in 3 states, Wisconsin, Michigan, and Indiana, right, by about 40 Electoral College votes. Actually, to put an even finer point on that, 125,000 votes in those 3 states, and this is out of 50 million voters, would have changed the outcome of the U.S. election. That is 1 in 2,500 voters. if 1 in 2,500 voters in those 3 states had switched from Trump to Clinton, Hillary Clinton would have won the Electoral College with the same margin as Donald Trump. So chew on that. Think of the last UK election. If 1 in 100 voters had switched from the Conservatives to Labour, Labour would have won the popular vote. The Brexit vote, which has put the UK on a completely new path. If 1 in 50 voters had switched from Brexit to Remain, then the UK would not be going through all of this related to their future and their relationship with Europe. And why don't we even look at the most recent French election and also the Canadian election? In the most recent French election, in the first round of the presidential debate, there were 4 main contenders, right? And there was only 5 percentage points between Macron and Mélenchon. And Mélenchon, just for a little trivia point, he's a Trotskyite. Like, he split off from the Socialist Party because it wasn't left-wing enough to start his own party, and he's an avowed Trotskyite. He was only 5 points back of Macron, right? But so think of it this way. In the bizarro world, if 1 out of every 20 voters had drifted from Macron to any of the other 3, he would have not have made it past the first round. We could have had 2 left-wing parties. We could have had Le Pen, the far right, against Mélenchon, the far left, in the second round. It could have been a completely different, I guess for some, a bizarro world in terms of the outcome. And that's why, many times, because of what I do, I have a lot of politicians that come up to me and say, hey, Nick, what do I need to do to win? Right? And actually, I always say the exact same thing. I say 2 things. First of all, act like people would expect you to act. So I'd say, if you're a conservative, act like a conservative. If you're a liberal, if you're a progressive, act like a progressive. If you're an environmentalist, act like an environmentalist. Act the way people expect you to act. If you're a conservative, don't act like a socialist, right? Because people will just say, hey, this just doesn't quite jive. Why this now, right? But the second thing that I usually say, and this is the important thing when it comes to elections, I usually say, okay, can you persuade 1 in 20 people to change their mind? And usually most people that are seeking public office say yes. And then I usually say, if you can persuade 1 in 20 people to change their mind and to come to you, you're probably back in the game. You've probably gone from being behind 10 percentage points to having a dead heat. And think of the last federal election. According to the numbers, and we're talking about Elections Canada numbers and the results, if 1 out of every 20 Canadians drifted away from Justin Trudeau towards Stephen Harper would be Prime Minister today, leading a minority government, right? Because the Conservatives would have gone up to the mid-30s, right? The Liberals would have dropped down, and we would have had a completely different outcome. So all this to say that you have to think of very small swings in voters having a disproportionate outcome on elections. And the other thing is that when we think of this populist anger, that it's neither right nor left. It's actually both sides, right? That this is not kind of a populist right-wing phenomenon. That there are people who feel underemployed, unemployed, are worried about the future, and they will opt for either potentially a right-wing solution or a left-wing solution, depends on what kind of tickles their fancy. But the interesting thing when we drill down in the numbers in terms of some of the structural underlying things that are dividing us today, in the old days we talk about, men having different views than women. We talked about rich people having different views than people that might be middle class or of a lower socioeconomic status. We talk about language as a divider. We talk about age fights. Well, what's interesting is that when you drill down at the data now, the new emerging division in our democracy are not these things that I just talked about. It's actually about education. That when you look at some of these populist movements, that if you look at the polling data, right, and compare people that have a higher level of education with a lower educational attainment, that's actually the key dividing point. And you know, the interesting thing about this particular dynamic is that when you look at from a communications point of view, these two groups are not communicating the same way that other groups communicate. And if I could just use an example, and this might be an embarrassing question to ask on a Monday morning. Has anyone here ever been to a professional wrestling event live? Okay, pretty high. This is a highbrow crowd. Okay. But, you know, think of it this way. You know, I want to talk about literal versus symbolic messaging, and this is probably very important in terms of how to communicate with residents, right? So think of it this way. I remember I was watching the U.S. election. And in the U.S. election, you know, we were watching those Trump rallies, and they'd have those chants, lock her up, lock her up. And I remember watching it and thinking, why does this sound so familiar, right? This just sounds familiar to me. And anyways, as a personal aside, when I was 13 years old, many of the folks in my family thought I read too many books. They were worried about my eyesight. And they kind of wanted to kind of toughen me up. So two of my uncles decided that they were going to take me to watch a pro wrestling match. I grew up in Trenton, so we went to the big city, Belleville. I don't know if Belleville's here. So I went to Belleville behind City Hall, right? And we watched the wrestling match live in person. And I remember, so I go to the wrestling match. I'm 13 years old, and I'm with my uncles. I'm with my godfather. And anyways, who do I see there? I see my teacher. I see a police officer. I see a nurse that we know. I see basically business people, everyone in the community. And anyways, I see them, and then the show starts. And then I realized that these people that I thought that I knew, and this is just think through the eyes of a 13-year-old, these people that I thought that I knew now suddenly changed, right? They're like when one of the wrestlers took a chair and broke it over the back of their opponent, they were cheering like, kill him, what, you know? And like, of course, for me, as a 13-year-old, I was thinking, they know that this is not real, right? Right? And anyways, so, but, you know, it's interesting. So what was interesting when we look at the U.S. election, I think is very informative in terms of how political communication and engagement with residents and taxpayers and voters is changing, is that, you know, for Republicans that were supporting Donald Trump, or why don't we even take the word Republican out, for people that were supporting Donald Trump, they took him symbolically, right? Kind of like in the wrestling match when someone took a chair and broke it over someone else's back. They knew that that was not real, but they liked the symbolism of that. So when Donald Trump said that he was going to build a wall, when he said that he was going to rip up NAFTA, right? They took that as the symbol of there's a problem with our borders, and you know, global trade is not working for us. So contrary to that would be the people that were not voting for Donald Trump. And these were the people that would take him literally. So when he'd say, I'm going to rip up NAFTA, they would say, well, that's stupid. You can't just rip up a trade agreement. When he would say that you would build a wall, they would say, what's the cost of that wall? And how long will it take to build that wall? And really, you know, that's kind of not sure whether that's achievable or not. But what's interesting is that those two groups kind of crystallize how politics and citizen engagement is now starting to change. And I know for the clients that we work for, I would say at the get-go, okay, so you have a project that you'd like to do, an infrastructure project, you have a community project that you'd like to do. You have to think of the symbolic messaging and also the literal messaging, right? So have your proof points ready the way you usually would, but then you need some symbolic messaging so that you can connect with everyone. Why? We need this because there is a fundamental cynicism and anxiety out there in the electorate, and I would say right across the country, in municipalities across Ontario, and that relates to the future, right? Only 15% of Canadians think that the next generation will have a better standard of living than the current generation. Actually, 3 times as many think that their kids will have a lower standard of living. So when you're talking to your taxpayers or your residents or your citizens, you have to think in their mindset when they see their property tax bill that they're thinking, I don't know if my kids will be able to afford our house. Will they be able to afford to pay our tax bill, right? Will my children be able to go on the same types of vacations that we go to? How difficult will it be for them to send our grandkids to university? And, so there is a subtext of the economy that's out there that even though when we look, and if we look at the Globe and Mail and Bloomberg News right now, the governor of the Bank of Canada is going to be rising interest rates because he believes that the economy is getting better, that people don't necessarily connect that to their day-to-day lives. It's kind of like what I would call joyless prosperity. The other thing is, I'm going to go through the next couple bullets fairly fast so that I can get to your polling, but there's a contagion going on because this type of politics, this populist politics, right, that is symbolic and so forth, is cheap, right? It doesn't cost a lot. You don't have to have a big policy kind of platform to do this. You don't even need, paid ads, right? Because a lot of this is happening in social media. And there's kind of a contagion effect where if you see something happening in one election, it actually influences politicians in other elections. And, what are we to do now about things like fake news? I'd always joke, like in the UK election, in the UK Brexit vote, there was a false claim made by the Brexiteers saying that that the UK would be able to repatriate, I think, £340 million a week back from Europe that could go into the National Health Service. It was actually on the side of the bus, and it was false. And I'd always half joke with reporters. So if you put the bus on the news, is that fake news? When a false claim, and when we say a false claim, the National Statistical Agency within a week of that went out and said, well, that's actually not correct. That would be like StatsCan. You can imagine if StatsCan corrected a politician and said that, oh, sorry, what's on the side of your bus? Actually not true. That's kind of the level of kind of disconnect in terms of that false claims and information that's out there. And to put this into context, in those 3 states where Donald Trump won by the smallest of margins but was able to put him over the top in the Electoral College, Oxford University, not like anyone, but Oxford University estimated that half of the social media interactions in those 3 states in the week before the vote were with fake news organizations. Actually, in the last French presidential race, 27% were with fake news organizations, and people were commenting, hey, that's not too bad. Only 1 out of every 4 people are misinformed and reading fake news, right? But this has to do with the political environment where if you have a municipal issue, right, and there are people that are contrary to your issue, that because of social media, they now have a platform to say whatever they want and to do whatever they want. And the interesting thing about social media, and I think judging by the crowd, you're probably of the same general vintage as myself. I remember when the internet first started and thinking stuff like, wow, this internet is going to be fantastic. Politicians will never be able to lie again because there's going to be this magical place where the truth will be, where if a politician says something that we can check, oh, not true, right? But that has not been the case. Actually, what we found, at least, is that for a lot of this populist type politics, that there's an amplification effect. Here's another little tidbit. So Donald Trump, people that follow Donald Trump on Twitter, retweet, they just press retweet, whatever he says. For people that followed Hillary Clinton on Twitter, they actually curated an answer. They would add their comments on it. So here you have kind of the angry retweet, right, versus the more engaged person who wants to add their kind of perspective on things. So one of the things we want to kind of put on the table here, and this is extremely important, is that when it comes to municipal politics, that all of these tools will be, not might be, will be used by interests to advance their own position. That in this new world, that it won't be enough just to say, hey, there's a project. Let me explain to you the 10 benefits of this project, right? That for people, and I kind of half joke, I don't know if Mayor Watson's still here, but I was kind of amused one morning when I was driving to work and I was listening to the local radio, and we found out that there was a protest against the building of a playground at Mooney's Bay. So Mooney's Bay is where the river and the locks kind of intersect, and an organization was going to buy and eventually donate a playground for children. And there were people that were protesting against this because they wanted to play beach volleyball in the same location. And they were on the CBC that morning as the lead story, saying that they were not consulted, that it was rammed through City Council, that their right to play beach volleyball could not be taken away. And yes, this was a children's playground, but still. And they had organized on Twitter. But it's kind of, in the past, these groups would have never even had a platform. But now there is a platform with that related to social media. So I guess what I'd like to say is that as municipal leaders, you're going to have to change the way you communicate. You're going to have to continue to do what you're doing now, which is kind of what I'll say the literal messaging, right? Here's why our community will benefit. Here's how jobs will be created. Here's how we will be stronger, right? Here's how we can achieve our policy objectives. But you're going to have to mix that with symbolic messaging. And then you're going to have to remember that when you are asking for something, that's all people are thinking about is themselves. What does this mean to me? And they're thinking about their kids and what they can afford and what they want and what their aspirations are for the future. So this is the Terminator picture. You remember the Terminator? I know we used to worry about robots, right? We don't have to worry about robots anymore because the interesting thing now is that on social media, the ability for anyone to game dialogue exists. So say, for example, for Donald Trump, 1 out of every 3 of his followers on Twitter were not human beings. That was a joke, anyways. They're actually bots, kind of created by computers that are programmed to retweet Donald Trump. 1/3. 1/5 or 20% of Hillary Clinton's followers were bots, right? And now there are kind of programs that are widely available where people can buy followers that will retweet things. And speaking as someone that is hired on retainer by the media, the way the media works and is that one of the things that they look at when an issue is hot is Twitter, right? If they see lots of retweets, they think that something is hot. If they see lots of dialogues, they use that as a proxy for kind of trying to have a thermometer reading on things. And what you have to watch out for are people, and you can go on websites, anyone can go on a website and download kind of an algorithm, and it sounds complicated, but it's not, that will harvest, create followers, retweet people. You could have your own campaign that can kind of reshape dialogue. So one of the things that we have to watch out for is that, many times a lot of these things that are happening in social media are actually not between human beings. They're actually between computers, right? But they are influencing the media, and they're also influencing politicians. So that's just the depressing part of my presentation. Let's talk about the polling that we've done for you. And what's interesting is that when we ask Ontarians, and this is a survey that we completed earlier this summer, the biggest challenge facing the government of Ontario, and people could say whatever they wanted, you can see that 32% said debt, budget, and the economy, electricity and gas rates and gas prices, the price of things, still up there. And then you can also see, and this is an open-ended question, and an open-ended question means they can say whatever they want. So we don't prompt with any kind of list, but you can see credibility of the government, leadership that listens to the taxpayers, also seen as a challenge. But the key takeaway here is that when people think of the provincial government, the top thing that comes to mind relates to money, whether it's the pressure that the provincial government is under or the personal pressure that people feel because of the current environment. And you know, the interesting thing is that when we ask the exact same question of municipalities or municipal governments, you can see at the top, infrastructure, transportation related to infrastructure, 27% say that's the top challenge. Then you can see budget funding the economy, taxes, construction. Not as much of a credibility problem on the municipal front compared to the provincial, and then kind of a host of other issues. So, you know, the interesting thing is that for the province, what comes to mind is money, but for municipalities and the municipal challenge, it has to do with the infrastructure, right? People go down the road and they're concerned about the condition of their roads, they're concerned about the condition of their parks, right? They're concerned whether we're actually building the infrastructure that we need in the future. And that is kind of like the top of mind challenge that people see for municipalities. But you know, it's interesting, we kind of asked a question about, I'll call it who gets what on the tax front. And you know, what's interesting is that when we ask Ontarians about whether municipalities should receive a greater, smaller, or the same share compared to what they're getting now, you can see that 2 out of every 3 Ontarians believe that municipalities should get a greater share of tax dollars. And this speaks to the room. So yes, the province is under pressure. Yes, the federal government is under pressure. But the biggest gap and pressure that people see in terms of potential growth has to do with municipalities. So this is kind of like, you know, what I'll say kind of the, you know, if we had one of those reality television shows where we'd say, you know, we had, you know, the 3 contestants were, it's kind of like Survivor, how about Taxpayer Survivor Island? Municipalities, the province, and the federal government. Well, in this world, if people were talking about who needs more taxes or tax revenue, it would be municipalities that would be left as the survivor. Not necessarily the federal government, not necessarily even the provincial government. It would be municipalities. And why? You know, when we ask about priorities, and this was another open-ended question where people could say whatever they wanted, an overwhelming 1 out of every 2 said infrastructure as their first choice, and then as a follow-up, another 29% said infrastructure. So, you know, it would be kind of like if you were to kind of build what you'd want to focus on in order to get people's attention, you'd say infrastructure, infrastructure, and infrastructure, realistically. And you know, the thing is that infrastructure is like 10 times seen as a priority, 10 times more, or more than 10 times than anything else. This speaks to the hook, right? The potential symbol, the deliverable, the priority that people would like to see municipalities focus on and would like to see municipalities identify as their priority. And I'd always kind of say, do you know what? There's the public policy objective, and then there's kind of like the political objective. So this is what you would put in the window. That doesn't mean that you're not going to do all the other things, right? You're going to do all those other things, but this would be the, in terms of resident engagement, this would be what you would put in the window, and you'd still continue to do all your other things, but infrastructure would be at the top of the list. And why? I always talk about proximity, right? How close is a level of government to people's day-to-day lives? You know, one of the challenges for the federal government is that when you're dealing with foreign affairs and when you're dealing with national defense, for many Canadians, not all, but for many Canadians, it doesn't connect to their day-to-day lives. You know, what you can see is when we ask Ontarians, you know, how important municipal services are, you can see it's Ontarians, it's a slam dunk, right? Now, the other thing is, that's actually quite interesting, is that we ask Ontarians about municipal property taxes and them increasing faster than inflation, they also kind of see that as kind of one of the key drivers. And here's a further drill down, I know, in terms of this particular question. And we've broken out, we did, for the AMO, we did oversamples in the north and the east and the south in order to get a little more granularity or get a better grip on what people were thinking there. And what I thought was interesting is that if you were in Ontario's north, that you are more likely to agree, or some would agree, that property taxes have been increasing faster than inflation. But the reality is that more than 3 out of every 4 Ontarians see this as something that's happening. Now, so you kind of, on the one hand, people see the need. On the other hand, I guess we can't have 3 hands. Anyways, on the one hand, people see people's need. The question is there an appetite for change? And some people would say we should be freezing property taxes. But it's pretty clear that freezing property taxes is not on the menu. 1 out of every 2 Ontarians outright oppose cutting services to freeze property taxes. Another 13% somewhat oppose, and you can see only 1 out of every 3 support or somewhat support cutting services to freeze property taxes. And a lot of times when we're doing polling, I usually kind of say, people, some researchers do stuff like they ask people, would you like lower property taxes? And everybody says, of course I want lower property taxes. And it's like 80%, and then council goes, man, we should be focusing on lowering property taxes because 80% of our residents want to see lower property taxes. But they don't ask the real question, which is, what are the choices, right? Okay, you want to lower property taxes? That means we're going to have to cut and find savings someplace else. And what's interesting is, and this is probably one of the key takeaways for you, that when you're talking about a lot of these big issues, like should we be freezing or lowering property taxes, because there are people that always want to do that, your response, I think, should be, okay, we want to do that. Let's talk about the choices that we have to make. So that you're not trying to defend taxes as popular. Don't do that, right? Don't say high property taxes are good, right? You want to say, well, they're necessary, but if you want to freeze property taxes, if you want property taxes to go down, let's talk about the choices, right? So to shift people off what I'll say the referendum syndrome on whether you like or dislike property taxes to the choices, what they get from property taxes, what they want from municipalities, and how it could be a lever, a positive lever for the future. But we have to remember that there is still a significant level of concern from Ontarians that there will be a shortfall. And actually, we've seen in the last year a bit of an increase in the proportion of Ontarians that are concerned about future increases to property taxes. It speaks to probably a certain level of fatigue compared to a lot of other areas. And then at the same time, people don't think that there's enough money, right? That taxes will not cover the cost for needed future infrastructure or maintaining other municipal services. So think of it this way, it's kind of like the pressure of, and I would say a certain level of sophistication where they say, you know what, we know that things are going up, they have been going up, we feel that we're under pressure, but you know what, we know that there's not enough tax revenue from municipalities to cover the things that we know that we're going to need in the future. So we decided to put some ideas on the table. As you might imagine, many of these ideas related to raising more taxes were not popular, hence the big level of red, right? New income tax? Definitely not. Fuel tax? Not. Land transfer tax to help fund municipal infrastructure? Not really, right? You can see a new parking tax. These were kind of different ideas that we've decided to test to kind of look at alternatives. And then we also kind of, the key takeaway to this is that when you get into a lot of these other areas, there's actually not a lot of default support. Actually, the default is to not support these types of kind of tax revenue initiatives. Then we wanted to get into the HST and HST revenue. And one of the things that we posited is that if there was an increase, who should receive it? You can see that more than 6 out of every 10 Ontarians thought that municipal governments should receive any increase. Only 6% said the federal government, 20% the province of Ontario. And you know what's interesting, when we started to unpack things related to the HST, the win, if there is such a thing, or what people, and win's not even the right word, what people would be willing to accept is if there was an increase, if it would be for something, right? It would be kind of like, okay, so if we're going to increase the HST, tell me what it's for. Let's be specific. And you can see the one thing that had the greatest amount of appeal or support among Ontarians was a 1% increase in HST dedicated to municipal governments that would be for infrastructure projects. And you know, you still have support for an HST increase if it was allowed to hold property taxes, but you do not have a support for an increase in HST if it just goes into what I'll say the general fund, with the province deciding what it's going to be used for. So the key takeaway here is to be specific. The other interesting thing when we look at the trend over time is that we're starting to see that the appetite is actually starting to increase. You know, I always say in the numbers, usually the way it happens, you have a particular trend and then you hit a tipping point and the numbers really start to move. We're seeing a particular tipping point in terms of support for the HST for infrastructure projects, and it speaks to the opportunity. And you know, even a bit of an increase, or the proportion of Ontarians that are opposed dropping in terms of using the HST to hold property taxes. And you know, the key takeaway is that people do not want, if you embark, and you know, the good news for me is I get to talk and leave. But if you decide to engage on the HST, you know, it's going to be very important for it to be fairly defined in terms of why this is needed. And you know, the good news on the why is that people on the municipal front already understand why. How it will be used, and then how it will not be used. Because you have to think of this, you know, when I talked about the age of voter rage, how cynical and angry people are, that people do not trust governments, any government. And you know what? People are even cynical about their municipal government. But at least for their municipal government, they can see stuff, right? That it affects their day-to-day life, which is why they have a greater level of proximity, affinity, and they understand the needs of municipal governments better than the federal government or better than the provincial government, because many times a lot of those public policy areas are removed. And you know, when we talk about the potential benefits, you can see that people think that if there was this type of approach, that it would have a positive impact not just on infrastructure, or accelerating infrastructure that people need, but that would also potentially have a positive kind of impact on the local economy. So let's go to my last slide, right? Key takeaways today. So Ontarians see infrastructure as both a problem and a priority. And I would say that municipalities have the credibility to come forward with a solution. But it has to be very clearly defined, right? And you've got to kind of have clear definition and also identify what it's going to be used for and what is not going to be used for. Also, the reason why this exists is because there's a concern that property taxes, even though people don't want their property taxes to go up more, that it is not enough to cover what we need. That municipalities are strapped in terms of revenue. And that's why when people think about our federation, you know, it's kind of, you know, people talk about the powers and relationship between the federal government, the provincial government, and municipal governments. And we could talk about all the fancy legal relationships and constitutional relationships, but realistically, and I forgot to say, the opinions expressed are those of Nik Nanos and not of the AMO. So just before I say this next statement, what really matters is the money, right? That municipalities have a revenue structure that relates to what they do so that they can deliver what people want, right? So you could get into fancy federal, provincial, municipal discussions about the Constitution and powers between the province and municipalities and the federal government. But the reality is something like this is probably will have more impact, because that's all people care about, is not what's in our Constitution and what are the powers between governments. That's all they care about are, what are municipalities doing for me? Do they have what they need to deliver the services that we want, right? Leave the other stuff to the constitutional lawyers. No offense for constitutional lawyers in the crowd. So the other thing is that looking at all the different options, and this goes back to choices, right? Do you want another income tax? Do you want a parking tax? Do you want a land transfer tax? Do you want your property tax to go up? Or do you want the HST to go up, right? You look at those 5 options. It looks like the one that is the most palatable is the HST. So, but I want to have a bit of a caveat for you. Do not go out and say, people love raising the HST to do this. People will hate this, but this is not a popularity contest. You have to get people to understand that this is a necessary and possible solution, right? So, the thing is that, if the AMO ever decided to advocate more on this particular file, you should not be kind of trumpeting how wonderful the HST is and how great an increase is and stuff like that. You should say, based on the choices people had, this is what they would probably like most. Why? And this goes back to my last point. We have to think of the mindset of residents. That even when you do this, right? Even when you do this, that it will not necessarily be popular among some people. But you have to kind of have the literal messaging, which is, here are the 5 reasons why this is good fiscal policy and we can deliver what we need to deliver. And then you need to deliver the symbolic messaging, like, hey, what kind of playgrounds and kind of activities, municipal activities and programs would you like your grandchildren to have, right? What kind of neighborhood do you want your kids to grow up in, right? The symbolic messaging that is more aspirational. So with that, I know we have a couple minutes for questions. Does anyone have any questions? I'm going to be sticking around anyway, so I won't be offended. Are there any questions, comments, an official rebuttal? Yes. Sure. Mic 4.
Hello? Thank you. Wonderful discussion or presentation. My only concern is the last point, the HST and the 1%. Initially, I thought, what a wonderful idea. And then I thought, I'm a small municipality, 10,000 people. Okay. I'm concerned that 1% will go to the upper tiers,
right,
or the larger cities. And that 1% will give me, okay, one of my bridges has to be replaced. It's $12 million. That 1% might work out to $500,000 for me. And then the upper levels of government are going to say, you have the HST. You have that 1%. And use it wisely. And I'm going to go, we really don't get much of anything. So that's my concern, is how is it going to work?
Yeah, I think that's a very valid concern, and this is where the convening power of the AMO, between the diversity of members that it has, is actually important for you to talk about. Okay, let's, and this, you'd always kind of think, this is kind of like, pretend this issue is the same way that you would deal with an issue in your own municipality. You'd have, if we do this and we get this, then we're going to do the following things. Like the plan is all there. So, this is what you've just put on the table is actually a critical factor in how this would work in the case that the other levels of government were willing to embrace this. And this is where the convening power, I think, of the AMO is actually critical in engaging larger municipalities, middle-sized municipalities, and smaller municipalities, so that residents in small-town Ontario don't go, hey, yeah, well, it's all going to Toronto. We're never going to see any of that. For them to think, what a sham. We were told that we're going to benefit from this because we have infrastructure needs, but it didn't help. And I think that's where, as you kind of, if you wanted to embark on this, you have to, I think, you have to start your discussions now on the nitty-gritty to say, hey, let's say this happened. What would be our recommendation that we would advance to make sure that municipalities and the diversity of municipalities that exist all get a fair share or a realistic share of kind of this new potential kind of opportunity. Thanks. Yes?
Nick. Bob Hadley, a councillor from the municipality of Centre Hastings, also raised in Trenton like yourself.
Good.
Welcome. The question I have is about the polling data of on municipalities and people saying that their first priority was infrastructure. I'm sure that their answers probably weren't, my first priority is infrastructure. It probably was roads or bridges or water or sewer, or did you get a sense of any, is it water and sewer biggest concern?
It was roads and water and sewer. What did you just say? Yes.
Yeah. Okay, so you've just rolled.
We just rolled it up. People don't use words like infrastructure, but if someone said roads or sewers or a water treatment plant, those would all be rolled up into infrastructure. So it's not like there's an infrastructure bucket out there, and there's diversity. And let's face it, different municipalities have different infrastructure needs, right? So, but I think it's just one of those things. You have to think of it as kind of a category that you have people's attention. You have to also realize that, under the previous federal government and under the current Liberal government, there's been a narrative that there's an infrastructure deficit, right? So, in a way, the feds and the provinces have been kind of pushing that there's an infrastructure deficit and we need to do something. But yeah, to your point, there was a whole long things. We did put transportation in there because in some of the larger cities, transportation was identified and mentioned a little more than a lot of those other categories. And transportation included roads, bridges, and public transit.
Thank you.
Okay. Number 4?
Yes, I'm a new councillor this last term in smallish municipality, about 75,000, Sarnia, Ontario. I'm not a big tax fan at all. I'm not big on going up another percentage.
That means you're normal?
Yeah, so I fit in the list of people and the voter rage and all that. Now I'm being raged at, so it's a bit different. The problem that I have with this is we met with our MP, she's a new MP at her office at a reception yesterday, and find out that the office renovation for her office for the building turned out to be $565,000 to do her office over. If we did that in our place, oh my God, we'd be dead people. So my concern is that infrastructure deficit, we have a huge one in Sarnia, and I'm very concerned about that. So it's obviously attractive, this dedicated 1%. The money, largely though, as it's spent and dealt with, can be proportioned differently. So that's where I would drive to that, okay, the one thing that you put up with, it was 47, 44, 9. 9% of the money goes to where the infrastructure is resident or largely resident. So we're not getting the money in the sharing of it currently. And to the point that most taxpayers would go to, it's misspent or potentially misspent. So some comments on that, if you might.
Well, I think this is, I think what you've put your finger on is a point to educate people, right? Because for average people, and you have to realize that municipalities have there are a lot of opportunities to kind of educate taxpayers because of all their touch points. And I would hazard to say is that you don't have to ask. If you just told people what was happening, they'd be like, wow, that's all? Right? And look what I'm getting in terms of, services and programs and the things that I see. And the other thing is that for a lot of municipalities, and when we've done, other research, it's pretty clear that very few people think that municipalities are bloated bureaucracies. It's, why? Because they show up. They don't, but, when they think of kind of that administrative burden, or that administrative kind of angle, many times they think of the provincial government or the federal government. So, so I would say 2 things. First of all, put a spotlight on what's happening, because that will activate, for those literal voters, that will activate them into thinking about things. And then second of all, to build on the reality that municipalities are lean and trim organizations, that investments go into things that people want and people need, programs, services, and infrastructure. So and I think I'm going to be cut off soon because I see the 0 clock, but yes?
Thank you, Mr. Nanos. And my first comment is I hope, I'm John Paul Jackson, by the way, from the Township of Leeds of the Thousand Islands, and I would hope that your presentation is available after the AMO conference, because there was a lot of information that was very relative to the community that I help represent. I'd like to dovetail on the first question that was asked by the lady to the far right, and comment that my municipality, for example, is very well set financially insofar as we're not in debt. And every time I won't say every time, but the majority of the time that we apply for grants for capital infrastructure projects, we are turned down. And the reason is that we don't have debt. So the government looks and says, you use your reserves or use debt. And so one of the concerns I have in trying to communicate the idea of a new tax, whether it be at a provincial, federal, or the municipal level, is trying to convince, in the case of HST, that as the lady suggested, it's not going to go into a pool and be dispersed amongst the larger urban populations, which goes to one of the slides you had where you indicated that there was an increased desire to see HST go up 1%, and yet the dichotomy on the other side is they don't want to see municipal taxes go up. So I was sort of curious to see the demographics in that particular slide. But further, and my comment is in part for AMO and Roma representatives in the room, if they're going to try and lobby this with the provincial government, is to also have criteria in there that does not go to the detriment of smaller rural municipalities that are set up well financially insofar as forcing us to go into debt before we get any funding from an increased HST.
Yeah, so a couple comments. First of all, do you know what governments love? To isolate and divide people, right? So if you got a bilat with the province, I'd say you've lost, right? What's more powerful and what's more worrisome for any level of government is when people and organizations and municipalities start to organize. So what you need to do is to advocate for your ask within the AMO so that the AMO can drive how this is going to work. Because what will happen is if the AMO does not drive it, good luck, right? They will kind of, the province, and I don't say this in a judgmental way, but the province as a government will write the rules as to how to do it. I think the best thing that the AMO could do is to say, this is what we think we need. We think this is the best choice compared to other things in order to deliver what our residents want us to deliver. And this is how it can be delivered. And to have a package that includes a reconciliation between small municipalities and large municipalities, rural and urban, municipalities that might be in great financial shape like yours, and others that might be having more of a difficulty. But the thing is that you want to get ahead of that in terms of the dialogue and start talking about those issues so that that whatever, because the thing is, to what I said before, if the window dressing, if you get the 1%, and that's considered the window dressing, but it doesn't have the broad impact that it's supposed to have, well then you've just missed an opportunity. You've actually implemented it incorrectly. So that's why, and these are going to be very tough discussions to have, right? On who needs what is a fair way to do this. But I would say that if the AMO had a position on if this did happen, here's would be how we would manage projects and investments and the distribution of HST, the extra HST, across the province. Here's how we would respect small municipalities. Here's how we would help large cities. Here's how it would work for those, regardless of what kind of financial situation that they're in. But the AMO has to have that discussion. Because if not, what will happen is that the province will write those rules, and those rules might not work.
Thank you.
So, anyways, I think that's it. So anyways, thank you very much for your attention today.